We're here today with Matthew, pursuing some more philosophical ideas. And Matthew contacted me recently with an email that I just thought was so provocative. He wants to talk about a kind of an intersection between the cooking fundamentals of building a beautiful sauce through reduction and Husserl's phenomenology. And as I was reading the background to get ready for the conversation, I noticed that there is a big intersection with N.T. Wright's epistemology of love. So I thought that would make some good food for a conversation. And I'm really happy to have Matthew here today. And I'm going to throw at you one of the things that you said in your email that I thought that was so interesting. You said, in this section of the reading on Husserl's program, you will find the mentioning of the res extensa, which is the material extension, something I want to discuss in connection with the faith of a mustard seed and all the likenings Jesus gives to induce in us thoughts about the kingdom and to measure out the length of our longings. I especially like that part, to measure out the length of our longings. So I'm really eager to hear what was going through your mind when you wrote that sentence.
Thank you, Karen. I feel as if I have finally found my philosopher. And he's not Husserl, but without understanding Husserl's contribution, I could not have found this philosopher. He happens to be contemporary. His last name is French, and he's a Frenchman. It's LaCoste, or LaCoste. He is part of a philosophical tradition happening now. The French theological turn. And this is profound. And we're seeing the ripple effect, I would say, in our very corner of the internet. Prominently in the debates or dialogues happening between Jonathan Peugeot and the New Atheists, where we get a bifurcation and juxtaposition of two ways of framing an issue. That of the materialist. So I'm going to start to ease in Husserl's language, which is borrowed from Descartes, of the res extensa. And we might say roughly that's the materialist position. Everything that is being has an extension, and that extension is the proper object for analysis. And the best way to get after this object for analysis is quantification. And this is why Descartes took upon himself the project of demonstrating how epistemology, that is logical conceptual certainty, is best arrived at in an experience that one can have by doing geometry. Drawing the circle, not as an artist would draw a circle, but as a scientist would. So I'm drawing the circle for the purpose of illustration to show you how every moment, every dot of that circle is in fact a tangent that I can now transpose to an X, Y, or some other plane of analysis for further purposes of reduction down to something without parts, outside the whole, that gives me a kind of place to see the whole in response to what I've done to get away from it. Wow, Matt, this sounds like the same move someone would do when they say, I got to get the hell out of my small town and see the world. I need to have many experiences.
I'm going to have to go for just a second, so hold on. Sorry for the interruption, Matthew. Can you continue where you left off?
Yeah, so I'm almost done rounding out the importance of the res extensa because, and I know someone hearing this might think, why should I care about two Latin words? The thing about philosophy is it uses words as a starting point to begin a more or less predetermined lane of thinking. And in that thinking is the choice of metaphors and the choice of which stories to tell for the purposes of illustrating how this lane works and unfolds. So philosophy really is preparation for a kind of living, a kind of marriage of thought and action across, I was going to say time, but it's deeper than that. Time and relation of self to world, self to others, the understanding of that relation in itself. So, Michael,
It sets some boundaries. It sets
precisely,
a particular set of boundaries that you dwell within and think within, so that particular line of philosophic thought has some cohesion to it and doesn't get dissipated out into every other line of philosophic thought. Would that be the right way of thinking about it?
exactly, because there is very little. In fact, there's only a thin line that separates manic episodes from deep and sublime philosophical insight. And what is the difference? Well, to begin with, the characterization of a manic episode is a clean stream of associations. There's no reason for the before or after, but it's a clean sweep through cat, dog, pineapple, cucumber, universe, self, blah, blah, with a lot of verbs. How is that any different from this projection onto the possibilities bounded by the history of philosophical thought? And if someone's really cynical, they'll say there isn't in language. And so let's focus on the at-handness of things, the knock-on-woodness of things. Let's be empirical scientists. Let's go down to the atom because the atom doesn't care what my predisposition to language is. It just is. But that is in itself a particular lane which excludes and includes. For one thing, that the philosophical project after the Enlightenment excludes is, and this is the other side of Descartes, this is where Husserl comes in, and this is the point of our background reading. Husserl comes in and says, it's a fine thing to have science, to have extension, and to measure things. It's a fine thing to make a good sauce, where all the qualities that you want to be there are there in the sauce. And the qualities you don't want to be there, the greasiness, the out of whackness of too much of this, too much of that, you don't have any of those manic episodes in a 3-star Michelin sauce. That's why I don't have to give you very much of it. They drop little drips of it because to have too much of it would be offensive. A really good thing, a really good thing doesn't have to come in gross because a really good thing is concentrated. It is what it is. So the making of a good sauce seems to have the character of a atomic theory or a theory of physical science. With electrodynamics, we can boil it down to 2, 3, or 4 equations, Maxwell's equations. And there's delight in presupposing that all the phenomena and all the galaxies really are reducible to these electromagnetic equations, which themselves, if they're sufficiently analyzed and encultured, open possibilities of understanding what matter in motion is and action at a distance is. And one by one, we begin to, in time, piece things together ourselves. Okay. But Husserl will come here and say, making of the sauce is one thing, tasting it, quite another. And this is where the God one, God two of Paul Vanderklay comes in, and where Jonathan Peugeot's symbolism comes in. Because really, when Paul Vanderklay goes into God number two, and when he does his sermonizing of the material, so he can take a lecture from Peterson, for example, and we all know he's doing this, and he's aware that he's doing this, and it's right for him to do this. He appropriates that material and sermonizes it. In the same way, a person will take a glass of wine and taste it, and then pass judgment. Ah, this is good for chicken. This is good for steak. And once I've made that judgment, subjectively, but not entirely in a vacuum, because I have the evidence of my taste buds, that wine is appropriated from the farmer, from the land, from its scientific ground, to this other lane, a house or a restaurant with certain kind of foods and not others. In other words, it's being relegated, reduced down to a pathway that excludes more than it includes. But without this, we wouldn't have a family dinner. And by extension, a lot of other things that we take for granted in our civilization. That's where Peterson comes in. Okay.
Well, so would it be fair for me to say that that tasting part of it, that connects to, let's say, I know reductionists and materialists and scientists always want to say that the empirical approach is this perfect program that is without presuppositions, and that no matter who does the science, it's going to be the same all the way down the line. But in actuality, it's how you observe the results of your, first of all, it's how you choose to do the experiment in the first place. It's how you choose which experiment to do. It's how you observe the experiment. All of those things affect the result of the science. And even in making a sauce, when you're making a reduction, like a demi-glace or something like that, yes, there is a science to doing it, but there's also an art to doing it. And when you're done, you have something that is a reduction in the sense that it is it's sort of the magical side of a data compression, because you've concentrated the essence of the flavors in such a way that it can expand out and affect everything that it comes in contact with, because the sauce changes what it's put over. The sauce changes its essence based on what kind of thing it's being used for, in the same way that wine changes its essence depending on what you're drinking it with, right? And the thing that struck me about the article about Husserl, when he's talking about this res extensa, he's talking about, let me see, I've got some notes here. In contrast to Descartes in his first and second meditation was putting aside anything where there's the slightest doubt. But Husserl comes in and he says, we don't have to set aside everything, because what they use this word bracketing. He would bracket things in setting them aside, specifically the existence and reality. Husserl brackets specifically the existence and reality of an external world, the beliefs that pervade all experiences, focusing solely on the presentational structure of phenomena as they appear. He performs an operation which has a similar effect of suspending judgment. And what that made me think about is, years ago, I used to be a consultant, a communications consultant, navigating the differences between Japanese and American culture. And one of the paradigms that we used in developing this was called the DIE. A poor choice of an acronym, I know. I mean, now they're using that for diversity, inclusion and equity, but when we were using it back in those days, it was description, interpretation, and evaluation. It's a way of suspending judgment in order to analyze a problem in a way that helps people who are coming from divergent perspectives to be able to understand where the problem exists, to be able to find the space where the problem exists. So the way it works is this. You have a problem. One time, one of our trainees came in and they said, Americans are filthy slobs. So rather than making a judgment about that and getting all upset, why are you saying something like this about Americans? You suspend, get yourself in this place of suspension of belief, and then you ask questions. Could you describe what it was that you observed that led you to this conclusion? So what he had observed was that when he went to the laundry room to do his laundry, this American came in with a great big basket of laundry and filled up 2 washing machines. So then you ask another question. Was your concern that he was using too many washing machines? No, not at all. It's that he had stored up that much laundry that it would take 2 washing machines. He must have had dirty laundry sitting in his apartment for a week. That's disgusting. Okay, so then I can come in as a cultural informant and I can say, oh, well, when I lived in Japan, I did notice that the Japanese washing machines are exceedingly small and you can only put a few items in at one time. So I used to do my laundry every day. Is that the way it was for you? Yes, we do our laundry every day. That's the clean way to do it. So, I mean, eventually you come to an understanding of why there's a problem, and you can explain the difference is that American washing machines are very large, and therefore people can, so you've done the description, then you work on the interpretation, and then you can make an evaluation. Then you can, if they still feel like Americans are filthy slobs, okay, but then at least they understand that their opinion is based on some other set of facts. And to me, that's the same thing that it's talking here with Husserl's approach. It's called, I think it's epoche or epoche. Okay.
Where we get the word epoch.
Oh, okay. So it's this suspension of judgment, leaving a space for things to be worked out. So I don't know if that connects up in your brain with anything, but that's what I was thinking about.
It's a beautiful analogy because it is so, I mean, I'm going to be encyclopedic for a moment. Fitzgerald uses this analogy of the pile of clothes in somewhere in The Great Gatsby to talk about a surplus of sensuous objects. And that's his way of overloading the reader with sensuous experience. And then, of course, he undercuts it to let us know that our sensuous experience is a fleeting thing. It doesn't have, even though it seems very robust and thick, it doesn't have what we might want to cling to as a substance, a rock we can see ourselves realistically hewn from. And that, of course, is borrowed, it's a straight up allusion from The Great Gatsby to John Keats in somewhere in John Keats's, it's one of his longer poems, I forgot the name of it. And this is very important because John Keats was writing during the Romantic period where the difference between the object and the subject and how the two could be brought in closer proximity and closer disclosure of how open they were to one another and maybe in need of repair was really thought through. Of course, with Keats poetically and Coleridge more scientifically, philosophically. And this ties in with what Michael's been bringing out with the middle voice.
Mm-hmm.
Because the middle voice is that place where subjects and objects repair one another. So for instance, the pile of clothes that the American brings in, it's an active engagement. The washing machine does things to the clothes and the clothes come out having things done to them, passive. But for the American to realize self-consciously, I am cleaning the clothes myself, says much more about him and what he is doing and letting be done to him as the person walking out with clean clothes in the end than anything that happens to be happening to the clothes in the process. And it takes a while in English to lay that out. We don't have morphology in our grammar to just see at the end of a word, oh, it's the medial passive, it's the middle voice case.
Mm-hmm.
We have to lay it out with more words, lexical words, and we have to lay it out with context. And this is one of the reasons why literature is so important in the English language, because it's a real laying out of all that extra stuff. So in many ways, our language is the American in that parable. And maybe more Eastern languages, older languages, morphological grammars are the Japanese ratio of one small load a day, because in that one small load, it's like a haiku, it's packed with what's needed for the day. Whereas the American, it's a buildup in order to really get at the sense of the word clean. Because as you so adroitly and well pointed out, that whole parable was built on the different understanding of clean that the Japanese had from the American. And the word clean there operated in the same way as res extensa among philosophers. That is, they're doing so much work to get after a specific interpretation of an event that's witnessed by the use of a word in a sentence that you can only get a sense of, a real sense of as a person, when you reduce, you take away all the things the word clean could possibly mean, so I can just have an encounter with what it means in your parable. And this is what it means for people to actually take time to understand one another. Finally, this brings us to Schleiermacher, which is very important for understanding Husserl, and very important for understanding our epoch in this day and age. Because certainly our epoch, the space for understanding differences and synthesizing our differences and coming to some understanding of how it's too much to ask of the American to change his ways, because essentially then we'd be asking him to become Japanese, which is to say, you should die and be substituted by one of us. That would make this whole situation better. It's a very dangerous route to do. That's totalitarian. It's same to say you should be a Christian instead of whatever you are. The world would be a much better place. It's very, it's easy to say, but because it's easy to say without the analysis, without the reduction, it's wrong. Not because the content is wrong per se, but you've not given the person an approach to get there, to understand how you're using that word. So finally, Schleiermacher, which is very important here, because Schleiermacher, Michael, if you're listening, Schleiermacher is your Owen Barfield, my man. read Schleiermacher, because he is right there in tandem with Barfield for this reason. Schleiermacher did a lot of things in the 1700s, but one of the things he did is he coined the phrase, the unity of the word sphere. It's very important. Schleiermacher identified thought with words. He thought they were the same thing. I'm not going to argue for or against it. I happen to believe it's true. You do not have a thought without a word, and you do not have a word without thought. That's what these things are. And therefore, every single word cannot be understood. No word can be understood in isolation, right? It has to be understood in the context of all other words and meanings, which is to say, if I'm going to understand clean, I have to understand your story, and I have to understand what it is to take a bath, and I have to understand what it means for a boyfriend or a girlfriend not to commit adultery with one another. And I have to understand what it means for a king not to lie or a president not to lie. And I have to understand all those things at the same time in some way. It doesn't mean I have to have a perfect arrangement of them, but it is folly to presume that I can understand any of those things in isolation without the background noise of those other understandings, which happen to take place in me at some time. Now that can change, and it does, but it always happens. That's Schleiermacher's claim of the unity of the word sphere. So it's very important, because when we get the word God, God, the word, is not exempt from this astringency. I cannot understand Jesus Christ without Vishnu, because I'm speaking of the word Jesus Christ and I'm speaking of the word Vishnu. I can't understand one or the other without the other's negation. Now, that means the best way to become a philosopher, the best way to make a reduction that's going to give you a sense of, oh my God, I've understand something, is to become a translator. That's the thrust of Schleiermacher. And when we do a Petersonian, you see, this is true, we all know this. Like, we know it's true because, in fact, the only way any of us have come to appropriate a grammar or a language is by translating. Dad says this, well, I know what he really means. So I'm going to do not the literal, what he's asking for, but I know how he's using those words. So I'm translating them to myself, and I'm producing a behavior out of the spirit of, I want to honor his wishes. You don't have to translate French into English to be a translator. Translation is always with us as our possibility of making meaning real for ourselves in time and place. It's the opening of the pathway. It's the understanding of clean in that example.
Well, so that just brings up a lot of things for me, because I actually did do some work as a translator when I lived in Japan. Not that I could have done a translation straight off the cuff, listening to, I couldn't have been one of those translators at the UN, listening to unfamiliar material and translating it. But I did act as a translator for the pastor of the Japanese church that we attended. When he would speak, he would do the Japanese message. He would explain the message to me beforehand, and then he would do the message in Japanese, and then I would translate as he went along for the American people. So I could keep up with him because I already knew somewhat the context of where he was headed, right? And it's a very interesting experience trying to relate in English what someone is trying to say in Japanese, even when it's about the scripture, because the cultures are so different. They think about things in a different way. They see the stories through their own lenses, their own parables, their own analogies in their world, and then you have to explain that to people of your world. And the other way that I've always been a translator is that I taught English as a second language for many years. And so I worked with a lot of people who really couldn't speak English at all, or very minimal English. And I learned to understand what they were saying and to be able to communicate that to other people who needed to know what they were saying, even though, they're working in a very simplified lexicon of English. So I got to that point with normal people now, where when I hear two people talking and I can tell they're not understanding each other, I feel compelled to say, this is what I hear John saying, and I would really like to let Harry know what it is that John is saying, because I don't think Harry's hearing it at all, which is one of the reasons I think I got in the middle of this whole thing, because I can hear miscommunications happening all over the place because I'm just tuned into it. That's how I'm built. But I want to get back to this thing about what you said, the unity of the word sphere. Do you mean sphere, the word, or the word sphere?
Hyphenated. Word sphere,
okay.
hyphenated.
Word sphere. Okay. So then you said you do not have a thought without a word. You do not have a word without a thought. Which seems to me, what you're saying basically is the primacy of language.
Not necessarily, no. And this is the
Well,
radical claim of Schleiermacher. He saw these things as ineradicably linked.
okay.
And this is why he would accept the Bible as a thought system. And as such, nothing outside that system necessarily tells me or is sufficient as a substitution to tell me anything about what's going on in that system. The only way to get at a system is within the system. Remember when,
So that's like
let's second,
expository teaching, where you rely only on what's inside God's word. Yeah, I totally.
but in order to do this, so this is where that fancy word phenomenology comes in. Because if you just stop with that claim of Schleiermacher's, you run into silos, right? Expository preaching, one verse at a time. We're not going to go crazy, forget the world. It'd be better if we could lock ourselves in here, because we need to attend and not be distracted, right, by any of the pop music, any of the scholars. We need to pretend as if we were contemporaneous with the writing. That's the only way to get after what John was doing in his gospel. The only way. That's problematic because we can't.
Yeah.
We have this thing called time, which lengthens out our longing physically from the thing itself. So this is Kant, right? There's the new phenomenal experience, and then there's the noumenal, and it's a spectrum. Here I am, Karen, talking to you, and you're talking to me hundreds of miles away, and there's a longing for understanding of not only what we're doing, but how what we're doing is being shaped by this factor of distance and the medium of exchange. And if only we could have this mutual understanding of what it all means for us now, and could then act accordingly. And that's a hope, at least I share that hope right now. But the moment I put it into words, am I really communicating this longing? Is it long enough to communicate the longing? Is there a one-to-one? Well, in order to really do that and know that you're doing it at the same time, you have to have a peculiar consciousness to attend to the discovery yourself of the thing you intend to look at. So you can look at that sauce. It's another thing to taste the sauce. But then the third thing is to be engaged with the looking, the preparing, and the tasting in such a way that you are never lost in the process, but that you gain yourself by regaining yourself in that middle voice. Well, how do you teach someone this? And how do you make them aware that I'm not asking you to become faith-based, and I'm not asking you to become a scientist in materialism. I'm asking for that middle way, which includes all. How do you get someone to do this? You don't do it by producing a scheme, by producing a system or a metaphysics, which is really just a list of things, because that's just another system you have to study from the inside. Remember, C.S. Lewis said in one of his stories, the only way to understand what's going on in the shed when the light breaks through is to be in that ray. You can't be in the outside looking and thinking, maybe I'll go in, maybe I won't. You have to be all in. And this is the experience of time and temporality. We're all in here. Now, with that said, we get to phenomenology, which is this study, presuppositionalist, like you said, of how things matter to us. Not how things matter, period, but the fact that we are conscious and always conscious. And that is a nice lane boundary. So in that article that we read, it talks about the first step to understanding any totality, any system. Well, it might be helpful for us beings to say that it is what did it call it? A transcendent consciousness, or a transcendental consciousness. In the pairing of those words, it asks for a little supposition, but not too much, that one, whatever is going to come to us, whether it's a book, a person, a sauce, we have to be conscious of it in some regard. And then two, it is always outside us. It's not one-to-one in me. It's a little beyond me. And this is true because we're always learning things. So everything's a little beyond us. Even ourselves is beyond ourselves. The fact that I'm 31 and before I was 15, it's totally beyond me how I survived all those transformations. And it's true in a philosophy. It's amazing how our concepts and words transcend. The Bible has been translated so many times. It's folly to think that it's the same thing. So how can we, and yet And yet we can use these words like cross, anguish, faith, suffering, taste, goodness, beauty. So, but we're always adding to the word sphere. So how do we approach it correctly? Schleiermacher said you have to do it historically. You really have to understand everything around something in order to understand something. And so he brings a little paradox of the universal and the particular. The only way to understand you right now, Karen, is it's impossible. And the way I can express that impossibility is to say I have to understand everything around, before, and after you to even approach you as you are in your totality, because you are what all that is. It conditions you, and it conditions your possibilities, which are in you, your possibilities, and me too. So how can there be an infinite you and an infinite me that now meets in conversation? Schleiermacher to the 1960s, 1970s, Gadamer, in his book Method and Truth, outlines what he calls the hermeneutical horizon, right? That we are in horizons that is like the wholeness, the generality of our past, our future, our culture, or the books we've read, the thoughts we've had. And we cannot understand anything about that unless we understand our place in all of it. And he's just rewording Schleiermacher in the 1700s, the unity of the word sphere. And then that's taken up in the French theological turn nowadays. Karen, this is happening now. These people in this book called Experience in the Absolute, which I have coming to me from Amazon, it should come this Sunday, called Experience in the Absolute. This was put out in 1990, where he makes the argument that he was confronted by Heidegger in the same way I was confronted by Kierkegaard in college. I'm just going to say this one thing, and then I want to open the door to you. When I was at South Dakota State University at 20, his book Fear and Trembling touched me, and it made it so that I couldn't focus on a major, and I left school. And I did it out of passion, and I suffered all the, my gosh, Matt, when are you going to focus on a major? From professors, from students, from going through losing my friends in one discipline, finding friends in a new discipline, leaving that. And it was suffering, and it was destruction, and it was pain. But I wouldn't have been able to have the strength to carry that lane change through without Kierkegaard's category of passion. Passion is what you have to use to be in the middle voice to get past all the objects. You go through 4 years, you get your degree. It's coextensive, it's quantifiable, it'll be a career waiting for you at the end. That is simply nonsense. And we see it now with the shutting down of things because of COVID. Everything is in flux, and it's always been. That's the real revelation. So you have to be prepared for change. And I couldn't have done it without Kierkegaard's analysis. And I'm coming to terms with it. Now, LaCoste came to terms with Heidegger's being in time in 1930s, where Heidegger said we are being hyphen in hyphen the hyphen world. And this is what it actually feels like to be a human being. There are things around me, my car door, and it's present. And then if I grab it and open it, then it's ready. And I'm at that moment when I'm opening the door to my car, I'm embedding myself in that moment by that willful action into a web of functionality that operates precisely the same way the words in a dictionary operate with each other. They are embedded in functionality of definition. And we do that with our bodies as well as the words do it in a dictionary. And when we get stunt car drivers, we also get War and Peace and literary theorists and great novels. It's this functionality plus the things are present and around me with possibilities. And we get these orchestrations of levels. And the thing is, that's our epoch. It's all the stuff. How do we find ourselves again in that being in the world without getting lost? We do reductions. And I'll just close with this one thing real quick. Husserl gave this analogy somewhere in that article where the way to do a phenomenological reduction properly is to imagine yourself staring ahead. And then behind you, there's this light. and you can see it with your peripheral vision.
Sorry.
Oh, you're good. You see it with your peripheral vision, and if you're going to be a phenomenologist, if you're really going to have faith, and I would argue this is the faith, this is how we update faith for the 21st century, because shelter in place, losing businesses, having a very contracted world, which we're all moving towards, we're all going to feel Heidegger's being -in the world. It's coming. And this is why phenomenology is so important. It's what Jonathan Peugeot's doing, but it's not explicit yet. The French theological turn is going to come to America, and it's not going to be deconstruction. It's going to be, okay, that light is behind us. I'm so tempted to turn around and look at it. But if I do that, I won't see it for what it is. Because the thing about intentionality is it's always so one-sided, right? I look ahead. The moment I look ahead, I don't get to see what's behind. If I look behind, I'm now looking ahead at the behind. And what I was looking ahead at now becomes the behind. It's relative. We have to fight the temptation to understand.
Well, so
But as a
the other thing about turning to look into the light is that anything that is between you and the light is now what we call backlit. So you can't see any of the detail in the item that you're looking at. I mean, you've probably walked in when the sun is setting and somebody's standing in front of you and you can see their form, but you can't see any detail at all because the light is coming from behind them, right? So that's one of the difficulties about trying to look into the light and ascertain what's happening. So
just the real quick thing is, and Nietzsche said we have to look into the abyss so the abyss looks back into us, and that's his will to power. But a phenomenologist won't do this, and this is how faith comes into phenomenology. Husserl said, instead of looking back, it's like that part in the Bible where Moses says, God, show me your glory. And God says, no man can look at my glory and live. It's just like what you said with the form and the backlighting. Okay. What we have to do phenomenologically is step back without looking back. Slowly, one step at a time, until we brush up against or go deeper into the source of the light. And this is the reduction. This is the draining down, bubbling out of the sauce to where I don't see the meat. Where's the meat? I taste it. I have the real thing. Show me the Father, and it is enough for me. Show me the prime rib. Have I been so long with you? It's right here. It's right there. You cannot deny it. This takes time. This is Heidegger's being in time. It takes time to go from a book called Fear and Trembling when you're 20 to finding your philosopher who's contemporary with you at 31. But it took all these other people along the way to give you that lane. It's reduction and increasing of meaning. And it's actually what faith does. It's the mustard seed coming up to a mountain peak that moves. It doesn't happen overnight.
yeah, so I want to go back into this idea of the reduction, because one of the terms that was used in the article that you gave me was Adeptic Reduction. So I looked that up. I'm always trying to find out what this stuff means. And I'm going to read the sentence, although it's not going to make much sense until you think about it for a really long time, if you're not familiar with Adeptic Reduction. In phenomenology, it is a method by which the philosopher moves from the consciousness of individual and concrete objects to the trans-empirical realm of pure essences, and thus achieves an intuition of the eidos, which is the Greek word for shape of the thing, of what it is in its invariable and essential structure, apart from all that is contingent or accidental to it. It's the principle or necessary structure of the thing. And I got kind of excited when I read that because it sprung to mind for me the discussion that Michael and I had through several episodes where we were talking about form and substance and connecting that with hope and love. Because the shape, when I think about the shape or the form, in my mind, as it all connects up for me with art and science and epistemology, when I think about shape, it's kind of like a wireframe almost, like a skeleton, like, or in the study of hope that our pastor was teaching on last year, that went back and looked at the history of the word hope and how it changed over the centuries. And then how Paul used the word hope and brought new meaning into it. There, Paul's concept of hope is that it's sort of like tangible potential. And that's kind of what a wireframe is. So if I think about, I'm here now in the moment, and I'm going to move into the next moment. That move into the next moment is a move into chaos, chaotic potential everywhere in front of me. And yet, if I'm moving into that next moment in hope, I have a tangible expectation of what God is going to accomplish. And that creates a wireframe that gets fleshed out or filled in with love. So it's a kind of a picture of how the body of Christ grows. And I've gotten a clear vision of that this last week, because my husband was hospitalized on Thursday, very, very serious subdural hematoma, and underwent surgery, and there were some complications. And I've had round-the-clock prayer support from almost 300 people now. And it occurred to me that we are not only growing individually, my husband and I, as we see God's work in and through his body, but the entire body is growing, being knit together in love, because we're all supporting one another in prayer. And then each of those people is also growing individually in love, and the whole body is growing together. And we also get this picture of Christ in me, the hope of glory. So Christ fills me with his all in all, but I am also in Christ, and I am growing up into Christ. So I'm growing up into him. He is filling me. So he's inside and he's outside. All that's there of me is a little shell, right? I'm the kind of the wireframe, but then I'm filled with his love, and his love is also all around me. So I also think that is a scientific picture of how the world works, that these essences or these frames exist. It has to be something like that, because otherwise quantum physics would be completely meaningless. You have all these different particles and spins, and if there wasn't some way in which they form up into objects, there would be no thing, right? There would be no reality.
And I just want to pause real quick and note the subtlety of what you did. What you offered at that moment, in probably the last 5 minutes, was a phenomenological account of the experience of being towards an end. And then you said this is a scientific image. Of course it is. Just not science with Descartes, but the science of phenomenology, the science of reducing from all that we could say down to what will enliven the hearer to really listen in. Oh, this example she's using, and then connecting. I know those experiences in my own life, and here's how she's connecting them. I see that. I feel that. I'm having the experience now, abstractly, which gives me the incentive to buy the conclusion that this is ground that is deeper than the atomic weight of helium, which has no tethering to anything that matters for me, who am bound inevitably by consciousness. And so suffering, struggling, will always be with us, because as timely, conscious, finite things, it is normal for the passing away, but also normal for the reconstitution. Like you've never seen a gap in existence before. That's not something that we experience, and therefore not something that we can give a phenomenological reduction or analysis of. Is there any metaphor that works for seeing a gap in existence? We always see a negation of something, but we never see a positive gap of being, because that would be no being. And there's no way to address nothing. But that's contingent, in a sense, upon our very being. And so we like to think, oh, well, if it's full of facts, then it's full of wisdom. Facts for who? But if it has this character of an unfolding, of a grounding, of a I'm landing on point, then it has this inherent character of promise. And that's when we follow it. We follow the argument because it has the character of promise. When it's put forward iconically, with genuineness, with a sense of the opening of the possibility of the thought in time with the words as they're opening up with possibility. Maybe one way to understand Schleiermacher's claim of thoughts are words and words are thought. You see that in the happening of language making, the subcreation of the language system itself. And this is very important for contemplating the divine, for contemplating being in the world, and LaCoste phrase, being towards God. To live with God is to have something like a phenomenological analysis stepping back into the source, timely, in time, with suffering. And it could be characterized as a burden. It could be characterized as an overflowing cup. It can be characterized in many ways. But to say that there is this neutral space of entertaining possibilities according to the weight of someone's evidence, I don't find that anywhere in conscious experience. I find states of mind, this is Heidegger, and the primitive state of mind, like a really basic one, was what he called anxiety. And here's a phrase, Karen. I want to see what you make of it. It's a lovely phrase from Being in Time, written in the 1930s. And I think this is so close to what I'm trying to say with the stepping back into the source. And I feel this as somebody from South Dakota. Yesterday, as you know, I print driver licenses. And yesterday I went to a small town called Parker, and I was there throughout the day. It's probably 88 people. When the sun set and it was time for me to drive back to the city, I was terrified in that small town. There were no stars. There was no one out at 6 o'clock at night. There was no building that was higher than one story. It was like I was exposed. It was terrifying. And I thought to myself, if this was forever, I would be so afraid of myself. And here's how Heidegger characterized phenomenologically an approach to understanding self-consciousness that I just gave to you with an illustration. But here's this phrase. The primitive state of our being is this: that in the face of which anxiety is anxious. It's such a beautifully loaded phrase. That in the face. As human beings, we are in-faced. We have faces. We're behind it. We're in it. We don't go beyond it. We can only see beyond it, but we're behind it. We're in it. It's our prosopon. It's our face. That in the face of which I cannot hide, that in the face of which anxiety is anxious. So the anxiousness of anxiety is characterized by that in the face of which it is being anxious and not anything else. It's that inclusion, exclusion of all else. And this sense of the imminence of the pressing down of the whole world inside my little body. And this feeling of, oh man, this town is so small. I need to escape and fall into the ocean of anonymity that is a big city. That fleeing from myself in the face of which I am anxious, because I can flee from it. But just as Joseph, or who was swallowed by the whale?
Um, J- Jonah.
Jonah, thank you. Just as
That was
Jonah
me there.
just as Jonah could flee from the call to Nineveh, he was fleeing in the face of that which anxiety is anxious. And it never left him, though he tried to leave it. And this is not something you can prove empirically. It kind of sounds like wishy-washy word salad. But in fact, if you follow it through rigorously, it is a phenomenological discovery of what it is to be being -in-the world. And what are we running from? And why is it so terrifying to be alone with ourselves?
Well, I
This,
have a
yeah.
perfect understanding of that this week, because I've been a believer in Christ for 40 years. And I've gone through a lot of pretty serious struggles and traumas and difficulties that have shaped me. And certainly that's a part of the whole shaping thing. But I've always felt a complete connection to Christ going through those things and feeling his strength and his presence. But this week, the floor just fell out from under me. And I felt untethered. And I depended so much on others to call me and talk me down off the ledge and remind me of Christ's love for me and just get me back on that solid footing again, where I was connected to him, but then also connected to the body, so that I could be the strength that I needed to be for my husband. So I fully understand that picture of to be in the face of anxiety, which is anxious. But I think this is a good place to wrap up, because I want to tie this into N.T. Wright's article, Loving to Know, which I will link. I brought this up many times, but I really hope that people will read this whole article, because he goes through the history of thought about these ideas, and he also talks about how he believes that this epistemology of love is what we need to bring us back together as a people here in the Western world, for sure, where we've become so divided. But he also, it's just such, I started highlighting the article about what was important in it, and almost every sentence is highlighted. So in one sense, the whole article is a set of small data compressions that just spring out into gigantic ideas, each one of which we could talk about at length. But I'm just going to quote here from page 7, because I thought this was a particularly good place to stop. He says in Galatians, after speaking of God sending the Son and then sending the Spirit of the Son, Paul says, and this is Galatians 4:9, now that you've come to know God, or better, to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the elements of the world? In other words, the gospel events have unveiled the true God in all his glory, the God who sent the Son and the Spirit of the Son. Since these actions are always God's initiative, okay, he is always pouring down into us. They're always God's initiative. Our knowledge of this God must always be seen as the reflex of God's knowledge of us. This idea is amplified in 1 Corinthians 8, which deals with the problem of idolatry. Paul is mocking the Corinthians' pretensions to any kind of special knowledge or gnosis. If anybody thinks they know something, they don't yet know in the way they ought to know. But if anybody loves God, they are known by him. So Paul's whole letter then is an exposition of what it means to love this God, to love not by taking the initiative, but by responding to the love revealed in the gospel, and to allow that love to be the mode of all other knowledge. So in that sense, we're kind of like the reduction, like the sauce, because our flavor changes based on the context in which we find ourselves. And the process of going through suffering and struggles and trials refines us and reduces us down to the very essence, so that we begin to take on the shape of Christ. And through that shape, we are changed by the context of what's going on around us, and we also change the context of what's going on around us, which is how we can shape each other, encourage each other, be shaped and encouraged by each other, you know.
And I think this is part of the already not yet of the resurrection, what you just said. Because it's one thing to say, when I die, someday I will be brought out of the ground with a body and it will be glorious. That is one form of death. Another form is the perishing, which you brought out. Things happen, people go away. But notice in our experience, we never experience the gap. Something always comes back. There's always a little legume coming out of the ground, just as you said. And that I mean, it seems fitting and appropriate to describe that as a sort of resurrection, at least a felt consciousness of a deal made with that which is beyond perception, sense, weight, hope, and what we hope and dream and feel and taste. There seems to be some deal cut, because there's never, that relationship is never severed. To use a phrase Michael likes, that it never seems to be severed anywhere in life, anywhere.
Mm-hmm. So that's a good place to wrap up today, I think. And I look forward to your next provocative email to know how we might continue the conversation.
Well, thank you, Karen. It was lovely. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you again, too. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye.